Well, welcome. My name is Mark Smith. I'm the executive director of what's called the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum. And we've been going strong here for the last 15 years, since 2008, to take what was given to us by Polly Wakefield, which was this private estate in the hands of one family for 10 consecutive generations, from 1706 to 2004 when she died. She created a trust to preserve it and to transform it into a public, a place where the public can come to hopefully enjoy the grounds and learn about the work that she did and the work that we're doing around environmental education, historic preservation, you name it, we do it. So welcome. For those of you, I'm just curious, how many of you are here for the first time? Oh, great, a good group. Okay, we always like newcomers. About 2 or 3 years ago, actually it was during, just when the pandemic happened, or began, we decided to take advantage of the downtime and redo the interior of these 4 rooms as you've been walking around. The ceilings were coming off the lath. There was water stains over the decades of leaky roofs. The wallpaper was in really tough shape, this room especially. And we knew we wanted to do something with the mural that you'll be hearing about through the presentation. But before we got to the mural, we actually were doing work in this room, and this mirror right here, the gentleman who did the interior work stuck a little video probe behind the mirror and said there's some pattern behind that mirror. And there was an identical mirror right behind you, and he took that one off, and there, behind that glass, is 1794 wallpaper, and which precedes the wallpaper that you'll hear about by 50 or 60 years. So, but the same, I think Deborah will talk a little bit about the production of this paper, and this paper was produced in much of the same way. So, when we got to that room, we didn't have any consultants to speak about. We didn't know what to do with it. So somehow, I'm not really don't remember how we got the name of TKM Associates, Studio TKM Associates, who came and fell in love with the wallpaper, and they'll tell you why. And we made a commitment to restore the paper, which was in really tough shape, and still is in tough shape that you'll see, but it's slowly being preserved back to its, maybe not its original state, but at least to hopefully be enjoyed for another 50 to 100 years, long after we're gone. So thank you for coming. I do want to promote two events coming up. On February 18th, we're going to do it's a Saturday, we're going to do a bark walk. It's going to look at, Debbie Merriam right here is our Arboretum director. She's going to be leading a bark walk, which is not a barking dog walk. It's a tree with really interesting and unique barks. And there's Polly Wakefield Love. She planted this whole arboretum. We're a certified arboretum, I didn't mention that. But she really enjoyed and liked trees and prized trees that had really interesting barks. So we're going to do a bark walk on the 18th. That's at 10 o'clock to 11:30 a.m. on that Saturday. And then our second in the series of Stone Soups is the last Thursday of February. We'll do this over the winter months, February 26th. Is that right? 23rd. And it's going to look at our maple collection. Debbie's going to lead the talk, and we have a very interesting and diverse collection of maple trees. How many varieties? 15?
More than 15.
More than 15 varieties of maple. We're going to look at 15 varieties. So as a way of introduction to our speaker tonight, I want to say a little bit about the paper. that you'll hear about, and it is the story of Lady of the Lake, and it just so happens that we have a copy of Lady of the Lake. It's not first edition, but it was written in what year?
1810.
1810.
First published.
1810, and the whole, it's in one of these epic poems that's in the King Arthur myth, within that myth. And the whole book is in verse, it's in rhyme. So when you read it, you kind of get into this cadence. I'm not going to read it with my glasses, but it's wonderful to read because you kind of get in the cadence and rhyming of all this Old English, Scottish verbiage. And the artwork that the paper is based on is called The View of Scotland. In French it's called Le Vue d'Écosse. Something like that. Okay. That's right.
Well done.
So I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Lacamera, who is one of the associates of TKM Associates, and Lorraine Bigrig is also her colleague. The two of them have been working. We did the first phase this past fall, and now we're hopefully to complete the second phase and final phase of the project in this spring. So Deborah, take it away, and so happy you could be here to do this with us.
My pleasure. Well, put it in now. Okay, so thank you, Mark, for the introduction.
Just turn off the lights.
Yeah, that way you can look at the slides. Yeah. Okay, so as Mark said, I'm Deborah Lacamera, and I'll move a little over so everybody can see. And I am a partner in the firm Studio TKM Associates, along with my business partner, Lorraine Bigrig. We are co-owners at this current time. The original founder of the company you see in the center there is TK McClintock, and our firm was founded in 1989. For the conservation of works of art on paper. Each of the conservators at our firm received a master's degree in conservation from one of the 5 training programs in North America. I went to NYU, Institute of Fine Arts. Lorraine is Canadian born and attended Queen's University in Canada. And TK was one of the first classes at the Cooperstown program, which is now in SUNY Buffalo, or at State College Buffalo, sorry. And at these programs, we trained in the theory, ethics, science, and technology of the conservation of art on paper. I'm going to show you a few photos of our studio, which is located in Somerville. And here you can see our staff is working on a variety of fine arts, including a silk screen by Ramar Bearden in the foreground, Lorraine working on a pair of early American portraits, painted portraits, and then in the back is the conservation of the frieze and ceiling decoration from a Rockefeller dressing room, which is now installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So you can see that we work on a variety of materials on paper. Let me just show you a couple of projects so you can understand the scope of what we work on. And then I'm going to talk about how that relates to art expertise in wallpaper conservation. So this is TK and I mending tear on a large Sol LeWitt silk screen, which unfortunately occurred as a result of handling or mishandling. And so on the upper right, you can see the tear before and then after treatment. And then this is a 15th century Quran page, manuscript page on parchment, which was exposed to water and then stayed in a humid environment for a long period of time. And as a result, there was extensive mold growth on the surface. So here you can see that we're using a fine brush and a variable suction micro nozzle for a HEPA filter vacuum to carefully remove that mold from the surface. And again, you can see a before treatment on the right and an after treatment below. And then one more, this is the early American portrait paintings that you saw earlier. These were actually treated some time ago, restored, and papers were used to fill areas of losses. And in fact, they were quite skillfully done, but unfortunately, the restorer used adhesive that turned brown and discolored over time. So he kind of, so his work was unfortunately compromised by the use of a material that doesn't age well. And so we undertook conservation to remove that adhesive, but kept the rest of his or her work intact. So the principles of damage that these different works of art demonstrate are the same principles that we consider when we're thinking about the conservation of historic wallpaper. Things like safe handling, good environment, as well as the history of well-intentioned but potentially misguided interventions. So these are all the same issues that we face when we're looking at historic wallpaper conservation, similar to that of the fine arts that I showed you. And of course, being that we're located in New England with so many historic buildings, historic homes, historic museums that still have very old or antique wallpapers intact on their walls, there's quite a demand for the conservation of wallpaper. And our mentor, T.K. McClintock, recognized this very early on. And we've been basically working for the last 30 years to build an expertise in the conservation of historic wallpaper. So these are a few of the sort of bigger, higher profile projects that our studio has worked on in the past. On the upper left is that Rockefeller dressing room that I mentioned, you saw pictures of. That's now installed as a period room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the top middle is Japanese leather wallpaper that was made for installation in the center block building of Parliament in Canada, in Ottawa, Canada. And on the right is the Zubair War of American Independence, which is installed in the family dining room at the White House. On the lower left is an early Chinese export wallpaper installed in Huistenbosch, which is one of the royal family palaces in the Netherlands. And then finally, on the lower right is a trompe-l'oeil painted ceiling in the Lodge of Retirement in the Forbidden City called Huanshenzai. So these are some of the more high-profile projects that we've worked on over the years. So the conservation of wallpaper can be separated into two distinct approaches. The first that I'm going to talk about is in-studio conservation, and the other is in-situ conservation. So just as it sounds, in-studio conservation refers to conservation that can be undertaken within our studio. So the wallpaper can actually be removed from its location of installation, worked on in our studio, and then reinstalled. So in this case, this was a very unique situation, and in fact, in this case, the wall was actually brought to our studio, not just the wallpaper, right? So you can see me on the right working on the wallpaper in our studio. This is actually from the Paul Wentworth House in New Hampshire. So the house was not located in its original location at this time. And so they were undertaking to move the house to its original location. And in the process, they were able to disassemble portions of it. And this section of wallpaper therefore came to us, but that's relatively unusual. The idea in conserving this paper was that the house wanted to preserve one roll section so that they could frame it and hang it for didactic display within their house. And then the other roll of wallpaper they wanted to donate to Historic New England so that it could be preserved as part of their historic wallpaper collection. So we undertook to remove it from the plaster wall, and you can see Lorraine here is doing a saturated water slant bath to remove the degradation products that have built up in the paper over the years. And in doing so, the wallpaper was separated. And so in the middle, you can see the different sections of wallpaper separated. And we found two really exciting discoveries when we were working on this wallpaper. When we separated the vertical seams, we found this very bright green stripe underneath. And so that is actually the original color of the background of the wallpaper. So because the wallpapers were installed with an overlapping seam, the paper was better preserved, the color was better preserved underneath that overlap. So that was very exciting. So it just gives you an entirely different impression of what the wallpaper would have originally looked like. The second discovery was on the back of the wallpaper. So this is a British export stamp. So wallpapers were taxed and stamps were put on them for export. And so these are very well documented, and it gives us authentication as well as very clear dating of the wallpaper to colonial time, to the 18th century. So these are some of the things that we can do and discover in the studio. I'm just going to show you one more in-studio conservation project. This is from, this is a late 18th, early 19th century Chinese export wallpaper that was purchased by Doris Duke in the 1950s for installation in her Newport home. And unfortunately, the installers decided to mount the wallpaper to masonite in order to hang it around in sections around the room. And the masonite was failing after 70 years. The masonite began to fail, causing large tears down the length of the wallpaper. And so we undertook conservation to remove the wallpaper from the masonite, which you can see Lorraine and I doing on the left. Then we flipped it over and was able to remove all the old adhesive and mounting materials. And then on the right, we applied a very high quality Japanese handmade paper with wheat starch paste that will support it going forward. And once the lining was on, we mounted it to these very large conservation quality panels. So they are covered in rag board and prepared with a series of papers. And the idea is that they themselves will not deteriorate over time the way that the masonite unfortunately had, causing problems with the wallpaper. But it also allowed the wallpapers to be reinstalled in the manner that they had been installed in the house by Doris Duke. So here you can see, and always fun to show people this picture because you can see that the scale of wallpaper conservation can be very grand. You can see how many people it takes to reinstall this wallpaper. So that's one of the big considerations when we're thinking about how to conserve and protect historic wallpapers. So now we get to the big event. It took me a little while, but we're there. This is, if a wallpaper cannot be safely removed from its location of installation, there's not an option to treat it in the studio. So in that case, the approach is in situ. So we will do what we can to conserve and preserve the wallpaper in its location of installation. And that's the case here at Davenport Mansion with the Lady of the Lake wallpaper. Let me see where I was going to go from there. So as Mark told you a little bit about the history of the house or of the estate. So the estate was in a single family for 300 years with 10 consecutive generations of the family living in the house, starting with John Davenport in 1706 and continuing through Mary Polly Wakefield, who died in 2004, at which point, as Mark said, the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum Trust took over the care of the house, and it has become part of their educational mission. The house was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2018. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the house that we know as it relates to the wallpaper in particular. So the Georgian mansion was built in 1794 by Isaac Davenport and has a history of substantial alteration and construction that reflects the family's rise in economic success as well as their adaptive uses of the property. So we know that it underwent a significant renovation in the 1860s when the kitchen was converted into a formal dining room. It's at this point in time that we believe that the Lady of the Lake wallpaper was installed. It's currently mounted on 3 walls, and afterwards you'll get a chance to walk around and look at it in person. It's unclear to us that it's not the full set of it's not the full panoramic set that's installed in the room, and it's not clear to us whether the 4th wall would have had wallpaper at any point or whether that bay window was contemporaneous with the installation of the wallpaper. And unfortunately, there's no documentation in the family archives that gives us any, adds to our knowledge about it. So we have to basically parcel out from what we can observe and from what documentation is known about the house to try and piece together the history of the installation of the wallpaper. So what we know about the wallpaper is that the design of this panoramic wallpaper, Lady of the Lake, was originally produced by Zuber SC, a French wallpaper firm in Rixheim, France, in 1827, using the imagery from Julien Michel Gouet's monochrome engravings that were published with the first edition of Lady of the Lake by Sir Walter Scott in 1810. So wallpaper historian Bernard Jacquet of the Musée de Papier Peint in Rixheim indicates that this romantic literary panorama was extremely popular, and I quote, sold well from the start and was regularly reprinted until 1864. So this corresponds to the decoration, the redecoration, the renovation of the dining room here at Davenport Mansion. We also know that the blocks that were used to print this wallpaper were destroyed by the 1880s. So we know that it could not have been printed any later than that. So we assume to a certain extent that it corresponds to that redecoration. Oh, sorry, I don't want to go yet. So the full panoramic wallpaper consisted of 32 rolls featuring 6 scenes from Scott's epic poem, which tells the story of romance and intrigue of King James V of Scotland. So I'm not going to try and tell the whole story because as Mark said, it's a very long narrative, but I thought I would just show you the scenes that are featured on the walls in the dining room and kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what they're depicting. The first large scene is on the north wall, and this is a portion of it in the upper left corner. It's depicting the great stag hunt, and as the story goes, the stag evaded capture, but not before King James's horse died of exhaustion. And so this is sort of depicting his prowess despite the fact that they never got the stag. So the hunting scene shows King James on his horse at the front of the pack. The scene proceeds around the corner onto the east wall. And then also featured on the east wall are images of the Scottish lochs and some tourists in boats visiting the lochs. And the idea of panoramic wallpapers was not simply to tell a story, but also to feature these beautiful landscapes of places all over the world. So this would have inspired interest and intrigue in Scotland to all the people who saw the wallpaper. So moving on to the west wall is the depiction you see at the upper right, is the depiction of King James catching sight of Ellen Douglas for the first time. She's the so-called Lady of the Lake, and her beauty was so captivating that he fell in love instantly. But unfortunately, it was unrequited. She was in love with someone else. So of course, the story is all about a love triangle, and which is classic. Next to that is an image of I'm forgetting his name, Alan Bain, who sings of the love triangle and the treachery that is to come. And then finally, in the northwest corner is, again, King James. He's being told of the treachery of, he's being told by Blanche Devon about an ambush that is awaiting him, led by Roderick Dhu, the leader of the Highland clans in Scotland. And the scenes would have gone on to show that battle and King James being victorious, but those are sections of the wallpaper that don't appear in this installation. So let me just show you what this is. This is from the Swedish National Collection. It's the closest that still exists to the representation of the entire set. It's actually not all 32 panels, but it's close. And so this gives you a sense of what the entire production of this panorama would have looked like, each of almost the 32 rolls. So it's interesting because Lorraine and I have done a lot of research trying to find other instances of this wallpaper in the US and abroad. And two early 20th century wallpaper historians, Kate Sanborn and Nancy McClellan, both mentioned the fact that this wallpaper was installed in houses throughout England. They named 5 houses. New England? New England, not England, sorry, did I say England? New England. And they mentioned 5 specific houses, 4 in Massachusetts and 1 in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, we've not been able to identify those houses to determine definitively whether they still have the wallpaper installed. It seems to us that perhaps none of them do, except for Davenport. So if anybody knows otherwise, we'd be very, very interested to know if you've seen this installed somewhere else, because it is quite rare. And somebody did reach out to us and suggest that maybe it might be in a house in New Jersey. There was some information about it having been in Georgia and then been moved from its original location, but nonetheless, it's very difficult to find, very rare to find this wallpaper here in the United States. So we've been reaching out to our colleagues in Europe. This wallpaper has been the subject of pretty major conservation treatments in Helsinki and Dubrovnik over the last couple of years, and our colleagues have been very collegial about sharing information about what they've found out about the wallpaper through their conservation efforts and their research. It also is installed in an inn in Portugal, and there's a portion of it in the wallpaper history collection in Germany. So again, not a lot of examples still exist of this wallpaper worldwide. That's a very good question. So there is some documentation of how many reprints there were. It's kind of speculative. Production runs were not big. They were usually in the tens of, so it wouldn't have been that many. Very often they were printed in 20-year increments. It's not as though they would have been printed regularly every year. It was not it's hard to know. It's all really speculation. There is some documentation of that in the archives in France, but I can't say like right off, you know, how many. There is some documentation of like when the production runs happened, but not always how many were printed at that particular time. But I'll show you how they're produced, and you'll see why they didn't do very many in any given production run. So, so I want to tell you that. So we'll move on to like the technical side of how this wallpaper was produced. This wallpaper is woodblock printed. It's not hand painted. So that's something to understand like right off the bat. Each element of the design for this wallpaper was cut into a woodblock that was then coated in ink and pressed onto the wallpaper to transfer the image. This was the earliest technique used for creating wallpapers beyond the hand painting. So, and though it is very labor intensive, especially when you're talking about non-repeating scenes, like in a panoramic wallpaper, it is actually more economical than hand painting. And that, you know, and that made a difference. It made wallpaper a little bit more reasonably priced. Still, it was a luxury item. It would have spoken to the family's economic success that they had a French paper of this quality hanging in their home. But it was making wallpaper more available worldwide as a result of this sort of technical advancement. So the firm that printed this wallpaper, Zuber, so they originally printed the design in 1827. And as I said, they continued to print the design up until at least the 1860s, but they are still producing other scenic wallpapers today, and some of you might be familiar with them. They have showrooms here in New York City. And so this is the only 19th century French scenic wallpaper firm that is still printing wallpapers and has continually printed wallpapers in this original technique, which is very exciting. And there were other competitors of theirs in the 19th century, but all of them have disappeared at this point, and they're the only remaining company. And they have a really great website. It's zuber.fr. And so I would encourage everybody to go look at it because it's really fascinating with beautiful images of both their designs as well as their how they manufacture wallpaper. So what I did is I clipped a little bit of the video that they have on their website so that you can see the process of printing a scenic wallpaper using woodblock prints. So here you can see the craftsmen are laying out the roll paper onto the work table. And then they hand apply a background tone. Now this is a colored paper that they're printing. It is a scenic, but it's in full color. So our wallpaper is printed in grisaille. So it was printed in about 7 different shades of gray. Whereas what you're seeing here is a scenic wallpaper in full color. But the technique is the same for printing. It's just color versus gray scale. And so they apply the background tone and then they smooth and thin it so that it's a very even, very matte, very thin colored preparation layer. So this is a hand applied color, but you'll see that the woodblock printing of the design comes next. So they hang it up in the rafters until it's dry. And this would have been the exact same technique. They're doing this now. This is the exact same technique that would have been used in the early 19th century.
What's the composition of the paper?
So that would have varied over time. It would have been a fairly high quality in the earlier 19th century, but as through the later 19th century into the 20th century, the papers kind of got a little iffy in quality. And then now they're again printing on very high quality papers again. So all of their colors are mixed by hand. it's pigment in a distemper binder, so a glue binder. They match their colors by eye, so there's a lot of variation. Even within a grisaille, there's variations in the gray tones. And each of the elements of the design had its own wood block. So this is the inscription block and some of the numbering blocks, these small ones, but each element of the design would have been cut into an individual block with color separation. So this gentleman has partially printed one roll. I think it might be the Views of America wallpaper, and he's going to print both a brown passage and a green passage. So he takes his wood block, he inks it off of this screen, he registers it with the design that he's already printed, and then he applies even pressure to transfer the color. And this is from a different angle. You can see he uses the pins to register the design so it gets in the right place. He applies even pressure, and then you can see that brown passage. That one small brown passage and a small green jacket are all that he printed in that period of time. Now he hangs it up, he checks it, makes sure he likes it, and then he hangs it up and allows it to dry. And then usually production runs, at least now, are about 10 sets in a production run. So he'll do that 10 times, and then he'll get set up for a different color and a different wood block. So in this case, it's almost completely done, the printing of this El Dorado, but he's gonna add just the darkest tones to the pink flower petals. So he registers his wood block, applies the pressure, and then lifts it off, and then those dark recesses of the petals are now printed. And again, he'll do that for each of the 10 sets that he's printing. So you can see it's extremely labor intensive. And then one last thing is they're going to show a color separation. So the panel on the right, they're going to show you how the colors, the sequence of how the colors are added. Each of these passages is its own wood block. They start with the lighter tones and they work up to the darker passages.
So the pins don't perforate the paper, right?
No, sometimes you can get a little ink dot on that. I mean, you can see a little color left behind by them, but no, they won't pierce through the paper. Until finally all the colors are there, and you can call it a day. So that gives you some sense of the technology behind the creation of these woodblock printed panoramic papers. So let me just see where I am. Okay. So like I said, they're very labor intensive, and therefore they were still quite expensive. They're even quite expensive today. If anybody's a fan of Zuber wallpaper and has gone to the showrooms, you'll see they're still expensive today. And like I said, they would have spoken to the family's, wealth, their worldliness. It was a status symbol to have these imported papers installed in your home. And it also is a testament to the expense that was put forth in the renovation of the house in the 1860s. So now that I've kind of given you this background about technology, I will go on to talk about the conservation priorities that we found specific to the Davenport mansion. I'm going to go very quickly through the list, and then I'm going to talk about them one by one. But climate stabilization was number 1. Consolidation of fragile areas was number 2. Varnish removal and cleaning was number 3. And then repairs of cracks in the plaster, and finally restoration of loss. So specifically, with any artwork, it's essential to stabilize the environment in which it's going to be stored. That's really hard to do when you're talking about a historic house, and particularly a historic house in New England, because the 4 seasons are beautiful here, but they result in a lot of fluctuations, which are not ideal for works of art. So rather than attempting to establish a museum-like climate in a historic house, which is unrealistic, we recommend sort of means to mitigate some of the more extreme fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity that happen over time or over the seasons in New England. In the case of the Davenport mansion, high humidity in the summer months was seemingly a bit of a problem. So, implementing a regimen of using dehumidifiers is one of the things that we recommended, specifically during, the more moist and humid months. But in general, the idea of trying to keep a relatively stable temperature, avoiding hot spots from heating vents or cooling, avoiding sunlight, are all the things that we kind of take into consideration when we're evaluating what the vulnerabilities are of a particular room of wallpaper. And in fact, the Davenport mansion is set up pretty well because the light that comes in from the window comes in on a very specific angle. The wallpaper is quite set back from the windows. So it was a pretty good setup for long-term preservation of the wallpaper, which I think is why it's still in existence today. So moving on. That said, it was not devoid of problems related to temperature and relative humidity fluctuations. In fact, flaking is one of the aspects of wallpaper damage that can occur as a result of this cycling of humidity and temperature. What happens is that the different component parts of the wallpaper expand and contract with changes in the environment at different rates. So the ink is going to expand and contract, the paper will expand and contract, and the differential between them can start to cause microfracturing. So we generally refer to this as craquelure in conservation, and people like it. It makes things look old, but in fact, it's actually indicative of a breakdown that's starting to happen in the surface of the artwork. Over time, those cracks can actually start to lift in areas off the surface of the paper, and then they become very vulnerable to contact. So people using the room can inadvertently cause loss. And so the extent of fracturing is very dependent, like I said, on aspects of the environment, like exposure to light or being close to a heating vent, but it can also vary dependent upon what the particular components are of any particular area of the wallpaper. So, for example, some colors have more binding media, some colors have more of a higher pigment ratio. So what ends up happening is you can find very differential responses happening throughout the room. And part of our job is to figure out, or to attempt to assess, why those different areas are most vulnerable to damage and how we can help to slow that down. And so one of the things we do, of course, is to consolidate flaking areas of ink. And here you can see on the right, you can see some of the flaking or the lifting surface, cracked and lifting surface. And Lorraine is applying a consolidant. So what we do is we flow a very dilute adhesive into those cracks and attempt to reestablish an adhesive bond between the ink layer and the paper. And Lorraine is actually using an alcohol-based cellulose ether adhesive, which has very good aging properties and is compatible with the materials that would have been used in the original manufacture of the wallpaper. So it gives it the best chance of long-term preservation or long-term stabilization. So once we were able to stabilize that flaking paint, we were able to undertake a varnish removal and cleaning procedure. This is actually super rare. We've had some questions about this already. I should back up. Varnish being applied to historic wallpaper is not rare. It was actually a very sort of quick way for people to, in the past, to saturate the wallpaper colors and have like a kind of quick improvement in the appearance of wallpapers that were getting old. So it wasn't uncommon that a coating or a varnish would have been applied to this wallpaper sometime probably in the 20th century. But the fact that we were then able to actually remove the wallpaper was what was quite rare. Or I'm sorry, remove the varnish was what was quite rare. So before I say how we remove the varnish, let me just say that the reasons that we don't recommend applying a varnish to wallpaper for preservation purposes is twofold. So number one, it can exacerbate cracking over time, because now you're introducing another material that's going to expand and contract at a different rate than the materials you already have within your wallpaper. And so it can very often initially seem to have a positive effect, but then over time exacerbate the flaking process. And number two, as you can see here, not all varnishes are equal. Some varnishes will discolor and darken over time, disfiguring the wallpaper. And so that's what happened here. As the varnish darkened, or as the varnish aged, it became quite dark, quite yellow, and then the streakiness with which it was applied became much more obvious. So it was quite disfiguring. It is quite disfiguring, and you'll be able to see in the other room some sections where the varnish has been removed and some sections where the varnish is still there, so you can get a visual on what we're talking about. But here are a couple of details. So once the ink layer was set down and stable, we were able to go over the surface with an organic solvent on small swabs like you see Lorraine doing here. And thankfully, the varnish remained soluble. So we were able to remove the bulk of it from the surface of the wallpaper. Now, we did not remove all the varnish. That's not possible in this technique, because the varnish has already saturated the paper. So there will remain some varnish within the wallpaper, but by thinning it down, we could greatly improve the appearance of the wallpaper and hopefully mitigate some of that problem that it's causing with expansion and contraction. And you can see the lighter gray, the more neutral gray tone, is much closer to what the original grisaille palette would have been for the wallpaper versus the very yellow, very discolored varnish.
Like the horse, the front of the horse seems to be more yellow.
Yeah, so this down this line, so this side is cleaned of the varnish, and this side still has the varnish remaining. And you can see Lorraine's kind of worked on the hind quarters of the horse here, and this still has the varnish on it. So she's kind of working towards the right in that picture. And again, you'll be able to see it in the other room, which is the nice part about being on site for this presentation, so that you can actually see the wallpaper itself rather than just having to look at images. So in addition to dealing with the discolored varnish, we are addressing the cracks in the plaster. So in general, cracking within the plaster ends up resulting in cracks in the wallpaper, right? Thankfully, in this case, the plaster cracks were probably settling cracks for the most part, and the plaster itself was not structurally compromised. So the way that we're addressing it is mostly cosmetic, because it's distracting to see a big line going through your wallpaper and your sky. So we are filling the cracks. And so this is one of the cracks. This is the larger crack. This is a close-up. This area is already filled with a white vinyl spackle material. This crack is not yet filled. And then on this side, that's the end product where the crack is both filled and then toned in with watercolor so that it blends with the surrounding area. So finally, the fifth conservation priority was restoration of loss. So for the most part, let me just, our approach to restoring loss is not to focus on every single itty bitty tiny loss that's there, but instead to address the loss such that when a viewer is looking at the wallpaper, they're not distracted by the damage. They can appreciate the wallpaper without their eye being immediately drawn to the damage. And for the most part, that involves applying a tone to the small areas of losses so that it blends with the adjacent area. So as you can see in this case, you're seeing the white plaster in this case, was it not? It's the white paper. I'm not remembering exactly why it's so white, because a lot of the paper was actually quite brown. But in this case, you're seeing those white areas of loss were toned in with watercolor to blend. And then you can sort of appreciate the fact that it's a wedding couple sitting on a boat going out to see the beautiful grottos of the loch, and not focus on the fact that there's losses in the boat. And then likewise with losses, mostly in this case, the losses were along the chair rail and the mantle. These are actual losses in the paper, where usually what happens is the paper will start to lift slightly along the chair rail or the door trims or the mantles, and then people cleaning and wiping or brushing by will chip that fragile paper off. And so this kind of corner loss and seam loss is pretty typical. And there actually isn't that much here at Davenport. It's very well preserved in that respect. But these little losses, it's much smaller than you're seeing it on the picture here. It's actually very small. This is enlarged. But we add an infill of paper cut to the size of that loss. It gets adhered to the wall and then toned in with watercolor, again, to blend with the area and recreate some of the design. So the idea really is that we're not recreating every little tiny thing, but instead we're attempting to blend loss so that it's no longer distracting. Part of the concept of conservation and the ethics of conservation is that the materials we attempt to use all materials that are reversible, so that if in the future our interventions do not age well, or if somebody comes along later and says, oh, this was so 2020 to approach it this way, it can be removed in the future without further damage to the artwork. So really every aspect of our work, we consider that long-term effect, because the idea is really not that, the idea is that we want to benefit the wallpaper for the long term so that it can be enjoyed for as long as possible. The idea is not to make it look good now. Now that could be something that happens, you know, we hope that it's going to look better, but the idea really is, the goal really is for the long-term preservation of the paper. So that brings us to the last consideration, which is the sky. So it was quite typical for scenic wallpaper skies to be overpainted. For the most part, that happens because of water damage and staining, and the sky is very, very thinly applied, and sometimes very thinly printed, and so it's very susceptible to damage, even more so than the more heavily inked design area. And so it shows wear much more quickly than the rest of the wallpaper. And so the remedy, in many cases, people thought would be, oh, let's paint over it, right? And perhaps it's an improvement visually, but it's not a reversible treatment. So now we are saddled with trying to understand why this sky was overpainted. What did it look like before, you know, what did it originally look like? And what is this overpaint obscuring? So we know from historical information that this wallpaper in particular was sold without a sky, without a printed sky. It was sold with printed clouds, and it was also sold with some very fancy iridescent kind of experimental sky treatment. And so we have been trying to ascertain which one of those is the one that was purchased for the Davenport mansion. And so in trying to assess that, we photographed the wallpaper with an IR camera. So it's a 35 millimeter camera that's fitted with an infrared filter. And the idea is that most photography is done in the visible light spectrum, but when you look at when you look at materials in different wavelengths of light, particularly either the ultraviolet spectrum or the infrared spectrum, you can find out additional information about them that might not be visible to the naked eye in visible light. So infrared in particular is very good. It's used very frequently with examining easel paintings in order to be able to see through the paint layers to the carbon-based underdrawing underneath. And so you'll often see this in like publications, you know, infrared images showing alterations in an image or underdrawing of an image. So it's the same technology that we were attempting to use here on the wallpaper. Unfortunately, not to great avail. So in this case, we were anticipating that if we were lucky enough, that the grisaille wallpaper would be a carbon-based ink, and that would show up in infrared. So it was sort of prime for this kind of analysis. But as it turns out, we could not see anything. And we assume that is because this wavelength, that this camera is set up for, this filter that this camera has, is not able to penetrate through the opaque pigments that were used for the overpaint. So it's probably like containing lead white or some other heavy metal, very opaque pigments in that overpaint, and the infrared just isn't able to penetrate them. So it's either that or there was no design there in the first place. So we can't be sure, unfortunately.
When there's no design, did it ever occur that they would add or supplement to the picture when it was installed?
That's a really good question. So there were paper hangers who adjusted papers when they installed. I mean, for example, houses where wallpaper was purchased at auction, and so perhaps that the paper didn't quite fit the place where it was to be installed. Wallpaper hangers or their colleagues would, supplement areas with extensions, and so it's very possible that there could have been hand additions to papers. It seems a little bit unlikely because in this case that anything would have been applied at the time of installation, because this was a new paper. It was very expensive. It would have been purchased specifically for this room, but it's not unheard of. I mean, certainly it happened. So even though we're uncertain about what it would have looked like, we have undertaken a cleaning of the sky to reduce some of the staining and accumulation of grime. This is Lorraine cleaning. You can see she has cleaned this section, and you can see that some of the staining is soluble and it's coming off with a citrate solution. It's not removing the overpaint. It's just removing the layers of grime on top of the overpaint, but it is improving the appearance of the sky. In terms of what the sky might have looked like if it was sold with clouds, this is actually a Photoshop collage. I took a section of sky from that that full 32 set that I showed you. I cut and pasted that sky into the east wall of the Davenport dining room in order to kind of get a sense of if it did have the sky originally, what would it have looked like? And so this gives you some idea of what that printed sky might have looked like.
So is there an ethical conversation about whether preservationists would leave it as it is, or?
I think there is,
yes.
And that's why we haven't made a decision yet. So we keep every time we come weekly, and every time we come, we fill Mark in on the new information that we found and how that's guiding our decision making about what to do about the sky, We haven't decided, because this restoring a sky to this extent is quite a leap, and it's not something that we regularly do, and it has to be, if it's undertaken, it would have to be undertaken with a lot of thought and to understand how we're coming up with the decisions that we're making, and how could we do it in a way that could be reversible in the future. All those same concepts come into play. So it is the aspect of this project that is yet to be determined. And so I think I just have a last slide, which is the guidelines that we generally share with people with owners of historic homes or custodians of historic house museums. It's kind of a long list, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but if anybody here is interested, we can, of course, share it with you. And it just gives some very simple, mostly common sense things to think about when you have a historic house in your when you have historic wallpaper in your house or your building, to really give it the best chance of longest term preservation. And then finally, thanks to Mark, who's been facilitating this whole project, and the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum Trust for making the preservation of the wallpaper a priority, and then the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund for assisting in the funding of this project, as well as all of our colleagues who helped to assist with the research.